This is the Visions of the Bible Part 2. If you haven't seen Part 1, then click on the link below and check out Part 1. Second Timothy 2:15 says, "Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed, rightly dividing the word of truth." Last week, the dispensation of innocence ended with Adam and Eve being judged and put out of the garden. Today we'll continue the second dispensation. The second dispensation is conscience. Now that man has a knowledge of good and evil, God would allow man to be ruled by his conscience. The word conscience actually means with knowledge. It wasn't very long when we find that first murder, Cain killed his brother. Here's the big question that I always get. Where did Cain get his wife? If you know, leave me a comment. Or if you're not sure, leave me a comment. But it wasn't that man was doomed to fail, because we also find in Genesis there in chapter 5, verse 24, and it says, "And Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him." Now, it wasn't that Enoch was a perfect man, or that he did everything right, or that he was even good. The Bible tells us over in Hebrews chapter 11, verse 5, "By faith Enoch was translated that he should not see death, and he was not found, because God had translated him. For before his translation he had this testimony, that he pleased God." So it was by faith. It wasn't that he was so good, but because he believed in God, he pleased God. So it wasn't that all man was doomed to fail. Man could have believed God. The wickedness of man only grew worse and worse. Let me read to you out of Genesis chapter 6, verse 5 through 7. And it said, "And God saw the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast, and creeping thing, and the fowls of the earth, for it repenteth me that I have made them." Once again, man failed, and God would judge the earth by a great flood, wiping man off the earth, except for Noah and his family. The Bible tells us in Genesis 6 and 8, "But Noah found grace in the eyes of the Lord." There are those that say that God is love and he won't judge sin. Well, God is a God of love, but yet he will judge sin. Noah and his family wouldn't agree with that. And then we read in 1 Peter where Peter says, "For the time is come that judgment must begin at the house of God. And if it first begin at us, what shall the end be of them that obey not the gospel of God?" My friend, God is still a God of judgment, and he will judge sin. God will allow man to rule himself through human government, and God would make a covenant with man. This covenant here is found in Genesis chapter 9, and I want to read to you verse 1. It says, "And God blessed Noah and his sons, and said unto them, Be fruitful and multiply, and replenish the earth." So God was going to bless Noah and his sons, but man's responsibility was to be fruitful and multiply and replenish the earth. And then if we look in verse 3, it says, every moving thing that liveth shall be meat for you, even as the green herb have I given you all things. So now man could eat meat. Up to this time, man was basically a vegetarian. All he ate was vegetables and herbs. But now he could eat any meat. We find in verse 4 that even though man could eat meat, the blood was forbidden to be eaten. It says, but the flesh with the life thereof, which is the blood thereof, you shall not eat. And then in verse 6, we find that God instituted capital punishment. And here's where we get the human government, that man would govern man. Because it says, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man. So God was instructing Noah and his family to institute capital punishment. In verse 11, we see that God promises man that he would not destroy the earth again by a flood. It says, and I will establish my covenant with you, neither shall all flesh be cut off any more by the waters of a flood, neither shall there be any more a flood to destroy the earth. In verse 12 and 13, we see that God gives a sign or a token of the covenant. He said in verse 12, and God said, this is the token of the covenant which I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for perpetual generations. I do set my bow in the cloud, and it shall be for a token of a covenant between me and all the earth. We want to notice in verse 12 that God said this covenant was for perpetual generations. And then down in verse 16, and it says, and the bow shall be in the cloud, and I will look upon it, that I may remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of all flesh that is upon the earth. And there we want to notice that it is an everlasting covenant. This covenant continues on even today. So we have the Noahic covenant in the dispensation of human government. In review, number 1, man was to multiply and replenish the earth. Number 2, man could eat meat. Number 3, blood was forbidden to be eaten. 4, capital punishment was instituted by God. 5, God would not destroy the earth again with a flood. 6, the covenant was and is an everlasting covenant. And 7, God set the bow in the clouds as a sign of the covenant. Hey, would you help me promote the video and click the thumbs up? God wanted man to disperse abroad and replenish the earth. But we read in Genesis chapter 11 and verse 4, and it said, and they said, go to, let us build a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. So the Lord came down and confounded their language and scattered them abroad. The Bible tells us in Genesis chapter 11 verse 9, it says, therefore is the name of it called Babel, because the Lord did there confound the language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. So now we have different languages and different nationalities on the earth. Don't forget to subscribe, and next week we'll pick it up with the dispensation of promise.